Oh, no, you will be recorded because you're asking that. So you're saying what? You're
I'm
saying
asking
what?
you to conduct
So
voluntary
I've never been pulled
Okay, ma'am,
over
if
for
you continue to back into this deputy, I'm going to have to assume that you're taking this as a refusal. If you continue to refuse to answer the question I'm asking you, I'm going to consider this whole thing as a refusal.
Encounter begins under the most ordinary pretext law enforcement uses to justify initial contact. A welfare check. A woman is asleep in her car at a gas station. There is no report of a crime in progress, no allegation of harm, no claim that anyone is in immediate danger. The rationale is concern. But, as with many body cam cases, the language of care becomes the doorway through which authority enters a situation that would otherwise require restraint. From the first moments, the balance of power is already uneven. The officer is there because someone called. The subject is there because she exists in public space while tired, vulnerable, and imperfect. What matters is not only why officers arrive, but how quickly the tone shifts once they do. Within minutes, the interaction drifts from welfare to evaluation, from observation to suspicion. A bottle is noticed in the vehicle. Its presence becomes symbolic rather than evidentiary. No driving is observed. No engine movement is described. Yet the bottle begins to anchor the officer's perception. From that moment forward, the encounter is no longer about whether the woman is safe. It is about whether she can be categorized as impaired. The woman's behavior complicates matters. She is upset, expressive, and defensive. She speaks quickly, references her history, her work, her sense of being unfairly treated. She gestures. She reacts emotionally to perceived disrespect. None of these behaviors are crimes. None of them establish intoxication. But in police encounters, emotional expression often gets misfiled as instability. What should be contextualized becomes pathologized. Her words are not heard as explanation, they are heard as resistance. The officer introduces an idea that fundamentally reframes the entire situation: that the woman was passed out in the vehicle. This single assertion matters more than any other detail that follows. If accepted as fact, it supplies the scaffolding for everything else: probable cause, investigative detention, escalation. The woman immediately challenges this claim. She demands evidence. She asks to see what the officer is relying on. But bodycam footage, by its nature, is not a courtroom exhibit in real time. The officer controls access to interpretation. The camera exists, but the narrative still belongs to the one wearing it. This is the first authority shift. The officer does not retreat from the claim. Instead, he reinforces it by invoking institutional backing. Another officer is referenced. The bodycam is referenced. The woman's attempt to contest the premise is reframed as argumentative rather than corrective. At this point, the interaction is no longer collaborative. It is adversarial. The conversation pivots decisively when the officer states he detects a strong odor of alcohol. Odor is one of the most subjective indicators in DUI investigations. It cannot be measured, photographed, or independently verified in the moment. Yet it carries enormous legal weight. Once articulated, it becomes a pillar of probable cause, even if it is later disputed. The woman responds by stating the obvious: she is not driving. This is a rational explanation, and under ordinary logic, it should matter. But DUI law is not built solely on ordinary logic. Concepts like actual physical control allow for broad interpretation, and officers are trained to apply them expansively. Still, legal thresholds exist. Reasonable suspicion must be grounded in specific, articulable facts. Probable cause requires a fair probability, not mere discomfort or annoyance. The problem is that these standards are elastic in the field. They expand to accommodate the officer's certainty. And certainty, once expressed, is rarely reversed. The officer moves to field sobriety testing. The framing is important. The tests are described as voluntary. This word carries legal significance. Voluntary means the citizen has a choice. But the way the choice is presented strips it of meaning. The woman is told that refusal will be used against her. She is told that silence will be treated as refusal. She is told that refusal will solidify the officer's arrest decision based on what he has already developed. At this moment, the voluntariness collapses. A choice offered under threat of punishment is not a choice in any meaningful sense. It is coercion dressed in procedural language. The woman attempts to clarify. She asks what tasks are being requested. She asks to record. She references legal counsel. These are not acts of aggression. They are attempts to regain agency in a situation where control is slipping away. But from the officer's perspective, these behaviors are not signs of engagement, they are signs of non-compliance. The system does not reward nuance in the field, it rewards decisiveness. The more the woman speaks, the more she is perceived as obstructive. The more she asks for clarity, the more she is treated as evasive. This is where escalation psychology takes over. Once an officer announces an intention to arrest, every subsequent moment is interpreted through that lens. The woman's focus shifts to her dog, an entirely human response that reveals where her priorities lie. She is worried about the animal's safety. She is distressed by the idea of being separated from it. But concern for the dog is not recognized as legitimate. It is treated as a distraction. When the arrest is initiated, the language changes. Commands replace conversation. The bodycam captures the familiar cadence of enforcement. Stop resisting, place your hands, comply. Resistance is declared even as the woman is physically constrained by circumstance, holding her dog, surrounded, overwhelmed. The declaration of resistance is powerful. Once spoken, it justifies force. It validates escalation. It reframes the narrative from questionable detention to necessary control. The woman's emotional response intensifies. She yells. She insults. She cries. She pleads. None of this helps her. In fact, it accelerates the process by which she is stripped of credibility. Emotional dysregulation, especially from women, is often interpreted as proof rather than symptom. Her distress becomes evidence against her, not a reaction to the situation. The discovery of keys later in the encounter retroactively bolsters the officer's decision-making. Keys are another symbolic object in DUI cases. Their presence suggests access. Their location suggests intent. But timing matters. Probable cause cannot be constructed after the fact. It must exist at the moment of arrest. Yet in practice, subsequent discoveries are often used to justify earlier actions. The narrative tightens. The arrest appears inevitable. What is striking is how little changes between the beginning and the end of the encounter in terms of actual risk. The woman does not drive. No one is injured. No accident occurs. The danger remains hypothetical throughout, and yet the consequences are very real. Arrest, charges, bond, separation from her dog, public humiliation. The machinery of the criminal justice system activates fully, all based on an interaction that began as a welfare check. This is not an anomaly, it is a pattern. It illustrates how discretionary power operates when combined with rigid enforcement culture. Officers are trained to control uncertainty by asserting authority. Once that authority is challenged even verbally, the response is often to escalate rather than de-escalate. The system supports this response by granting wide latitude and by interpreting ambiguity in favor of enforcement. The woman's repeated references to legal action, to lawsuits, to attorneys are often mocked in popular discourse. They are seen as empty threats. But in reality, they reflect a deep mistrust of the system born from experience. People do not invoke lawyers casually. They do so when they feel unheard, misrepresented, or trapped. In this case, those feelings are not unfounded. By the end of the first phase of this encounter, the outcome is already sealed. The officer has articulated order. He has framed refusal. He has declared arrest. Everything that follows is procedural cleanup. The welfare check has transformed into a DUI case, not because new evidence emerged, but because the initial interpretation hardened and resisted challenge. This is how small decisions compound. A welfare check becomes a detention. A bottle becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes probable cause. Voluntary tests become mandatory in practice. Emotional distress becomes resistance. And a person who posed no immediate threat becomes another entry in the system. The bodycam does not lie, but it does not tell the whole truth on its own. It shows actions, not intentions. It captures sound, not context. To understand what happened here, one must look beyond the moment of arrest and examine the structural incentives that shape officer behavior. This case is not about one bad decision. It is about a sequence of decisions that all point in the same direction because the system rarely encourages reversal once authority has been asserted. In the next phase, the consequences of those decisions will unfold. The arrest will ripple outward, affecting not just the woman, but everyone and everything connected to her in that moment. The emotional aftermath, the justifications offered, and the institutional responses will reveal how accountability is often deferred, diluted, or denied altogether. Once the decision to arrest is made, the encounter enters a different phase, one governed less by investigation and more by containment. The tone hardens. Dialogue gives way to directives. The officer's role is no longer to determine what happened, but to ensure compliance with a process already set in motion. This transition is critical because it reveals how authority, once exercised, becomes self-justifying. Every action after this point exists to support the decision that came before it. The woman's focus narrows to what she can still control. Her dog becomes central. This is not incidental. In moments of acute stress, people often anchor themselves to something tangible, something that represents safety or responsibility. The dog is not a prop in her distress, it is the clearest indicator that her priorities are not evasion or dominance, but protection. Yet the system has no space for that distinction. The presence of the animal is treated as an inconvenience, a complication to be managed, rather than a legitimate concern to be addressed with care. As officers take physical control, the language of resistance is repeated. This repetition matters. Stop resisting is not merely a command, it is a narrative device. Once spoken, it reframes the physical interaction as necessary force rather than contested restraint. Even if the resistance is minimal, incidental, or non-existent, the verbal declaration creates a record that will later be relied upon. Bodycam footage may show confusion, imbalance, or emotional distress, but the audio asserts defiance. In institutional review, the words often outweigh the visuals. The woman's emotional state escalates rapidly. She shouts, she insults, she pleads. To an outside observer, this may appear chaotic, even self-sabotaging. But in context, it is the predictable outcome of perceived injustice combined with powerlessness. She believes she is being arrested without justification. She believes her explanations have been ignored. She believes the situation is spiraling beyond her control. Her voice rises because nothing else seems to register. Law enforcement training emphasizes command, presence, and control, but often neglects the psychological impact of sudden authority shifts on civilians. When a person moves from conversational interaction to physical restraint in a matter of seconds, the nervous system reacts. Fight, flight, or freeze responses emerge. What officers interpret as defiance is frequently a stress response. The system, however, is not designed to differentiate between the two in real time. The handling of the dog illustrates this disconnect vividly. Officers eventually remove the animal, attempting to secure it. On paper, this is a practical step. In reality, it is emotionally devastating for the woman. The dog's confusion mirrors her own. The separation amplifies her distress, and yet, from the perspective of procedure, the problem is solved. The animal is no longer in the way. The arrest can proceed cleanly. This is how human costs are minimized within institutional logic. Emotional harm is not easily quantified, so it is deprioritized. The focus remains on completing the arrest, transporting the subject, and documenting the justification. Everything else becomes background noise. As the woman is moved away from the vehicle, the physicality of the encounter intensifies. She stumbles. She struggles to keep her balance. Officers grip her arms. Again, the question arises, is this resistance, or is it the result of uneven footing, emotional overload, and sudden movement? The distinction is rarely explored. The assumption defaults to resistance because resistance validates control. At this stage, the officer's earlier assertions begin to crystallize into formal charges. DUI is named. Resisting is added. These charges are not merely descriptive, they are strategic. Each one reinforces the other. DUI justifies the initial arrest. Resisting justifies the force used during that arrest. Together, they create a closed loop of justification that is difficult to penetrate later. The woman continues to protest verbally. She references her career, her experience, her belief that this is abuse. To critics, this may sound like entitlement. To analysts, it sounds like someone grasping for recognition in a system that has already categorized her. Once categorized, individual history becomes irrelevant. The system does not care who you are, it cares what box you fit into. The mention of legal action, lawyers, and lawsuits is often dismissed by officers as bluster. but its presence here is telling. It signals that the woman understands, at least intuitively, that the street is not where justice will be decided. She knows that once handcuffs are on, the only arena left is the courtroom. Her words are less a threat than a coping mechanism, an attempt to assert future accountability in a moment where none exists. As she is placed into custody, the narrative solidifies. The officer has probable cause. The subject refused tests. The subject resisted. The report will reflect this sequence with clarity and confidence. What it will not fully capture is the ambiguity that preceded it, the contested interpretations, the emotional volatility, the subjective judgments. This is one of the central failures of body camera policing. Cameras were introduced as tools of transparency, but they operate within the same narrative frameworks as written reports. They show what happens, but they do not force reconsideration of why it happens. If an officer believes an arrest is justified, the footage becomes supporting evidence rather than an opportunity for reflection. The discovery of the keys later in the process exemplifies this dynamic. Keys are located. Their presence reinforces the idea that the woman had access to the vehicle. But access is not action. Possession is not movement. Still, the discovery feels validating to the officers involved. It quiets any lingering doubt. It makes the arrest feel inevitable, even if that inevitability is constructed after the fact. From the woman's perspective, this discovery likely feels irrelevant. She was never driving. She never intended to drive. Her focus was rest, not movement. But intent is notoriously difficult to prove, and in DUI law, it often takes a back seat to possibility. The system is designed to err on the side of enforcement, not restraint. As the encounter concludes, the woman is left in custody, emotionally exhausted, separated from her dog, facing serious charges. The officers move on. For them, this is one call among many. The emotional residue dissipates quickly. The system absorbs the incident and continues functioning as designed. What remains is a case file. In that file, the woman is labeled. The welfare check is a footnote. The escalation is normalized. The arrest is justified. The resisting charge explains the force. The bond amount quantifies the seriousness. Everything fits neatly. But outside the file, the consequences linger. Legal fees, court dates, employment implications, emotional trauma, distrust of law enforcement. These costs are not evenly distributed. They fall disproportionately on those who lack the resources or composure to navigate high-stress encounters flawlessly. The margin for error is thin, and the penalties for missteps are severe. This case underscores how quickly protective policing can morph into punitive enforcement when discretion is exercised without humility. The officer did not need to be malicious to cause harm. He needed only to be certain. Certainty, when paired with authority, is often enough. The system encourages this certainty. Officers are trained to act decisively, to control scenes, to avoid hesitation. These instincts save lives in genuinely dangerous situations. But when applied indiscriminately, they create harm where none was necessary. A sleeping woman in a parked car becomes a suspect. A welfare check becomes a criminal case. As the second phase of this story closes, the immediate drama subsides, but the institutional process accelerates. Charges are formalized. Narratives are locked in. The woman's fate moves from the street to the system. What happens next will depend less on what actually occurred and more on how it is interpreted, documented, and defended. In the final phase, the broader implications come into focus. Patterns emerge, accountability is tested, and the question shifts from one individual encounter to the structures that allow such encounters to unfold the same way, again and again. By the time the woman is formally charged, the most consequential decisions in this case have already been made. Everything that follows court appearances, bond conditions, legal arguments exists within a framework established during those first minutes of contact. This is the enduring power of frontline discretion. Street-level decisions do not merely initiate cases, they define the boundaries of what justice can look like afterward. The charge of driving under the influence rests not on observed driving, but on interpretation. Interpretation of odor, interpretation of posture, interpretation of emotional expression, interpretation of refusal. Each of these elements, taken alone, is weak. Together, they form a narrative strong enough to survive initial scrutiny. This is how probable cause often functions in practice. Not as a singular, compelling fact, but as an accumulation of subjective judgments that reinforce one another. Resisting, the secondary charge, serves a different purpose. It does not speak to the woman's alleged impairment, it speaks to her reaction to authority. Resisting charges are uniquely powerful because they shift focus away from the legality of the initial stop or arrest. Once resistance is alleged, the conversation becomes about compliance rather than justification. The original question, was this arrest necessary, fades into the background. This dynamic has profound implications for accountability. In court, the resisting charge can overshadow the underlying offense. Even if the DUI case weakens, the resistance remains. It becomes a bargaining chip, a pressure point. Many defendants accept pleas not because they believe they are guilty, but because the cost of fighting is too high. The system relies on this calculus. The woman's case is emblematic of this process. Her distress, her insistence on her rights, her refusal to perform tests under coercive conditions, all of these are reframed as evidence of wrongdoing. The system does not ask whether her reactions were reasonable under the circumstances. It asks only whether they were compliant. This is a critical distinction. Compliance is not the same as legality. A person can comply with unlawful orders, and a person can resist unlawful treatment. But in practice, resistance is punished regardless of its moral or legal basis. The burden shifts to the individual to prove that the authority was misused, a task that is notoriously difficult. Bodycam footage is often presented as a safeguard against this imbalance, and in some cases, it is. Clear misconduct, undeniable abuse, and blatant dishonesty have been exposed through video evidence. But most cases do not involve such extremes. They exist in gray areas where interpretation reigns. In those spaces, bodycam footage often reinforces the officer's narrative simply by existing. Viewers may watch this footage and see a woman unraveling, shouting, insulting, losing composure. Without context, it is easy to judge. It is easy to say she should have stayed calm, should have cooperated, should have handled it better. This perspective, while common, misses the structural reality. The expectation that civilians perform emotional perfection under duress is unrealistic and unfair. The system, however, demands it. Officers are granted wide latitude to be firm, assertive, even aggressive, under the banner of control. Civilians are expected to remain calm, respectful, and deferential, regardless of how they are treated. When this asymmetry is violated, when a civilian expresses anger or fear, it is interpreted as a threat to order. The institutional response to cases like this rarely involves introspection. Internal reviews tend to focus on policy compliance rather than outcome justice. Did the officer articulate odor? Yes. Did he offer field sobriety tests? Yes. Did the subject refuse? Yes. Did the officer announce arrest and resistance? Yeah. Boxes are checked. The encounter is deemed appropriate. What is missing from this evaluation is a consideration of alternatives. Could the welfare check have ended with the woman being allowed to rest? Could the presence of alcohol have been noted without escalation? Could the officer have clarified the voluntary nature of the tests without threatening arrest? Could de-escalation have been prioritized over control? These questions are rarely asked because they challenge the default orientation of enforcement. The woman's bond amount, while not extraordinary in the system's eyes, represents another layer of consequence. Monetary conditions of release disproportionately affect those without financial flexibility. Bond is framed as a neutral mechanism to ensure court appearance, but in practice, it functions as a punitive measure. Freedom becomes contingent on payment, not risk. Beyond the legal ramifications, there is the psychological aftermath. Encounters like this leave lasting marks. Trust in law enforcement erodes. Future interactions are approached with fear or hostility. The memory of being powerless, of having one's words dismissed and one's body controlled, does not fade easily. These individual experiences accumulate, shaping public perception and community relations. From a broader perspective, this case illustrates how systems perpetuate patterns of harm without overt malice. The officer did not need to intend injustice. He operated within a framework that rewards suspicion, discourages retreat, and prioritizes control. The woman did not need to be perfect to deserve fair treatment. Yet perfection, is implicitly required to avoid escalation. The most troubling aspect of this story is not the arrest itself, but how ordinary it is. Similar encounters play out daily across jurisdictions. Welfare checks turn into criminal investigations. Minor infractions escalate into arrests. Emotional responses are punished. Animals, children, and bystanders are collateral damage. Accountability, when it comes, is often external and delayed. Civil lawsuits. Media scrutiny. Public outrage. These mechanisms exist because internal systems frequently fail to self-correct. But they are blunt instruments. They address symptoms rather than causes. They react rather than prevent. Preventing cases like this requires a fundamental shift in how discretion is taught and exercised. It requires recognizing that authority does not diminish when it de-escalates, it strengthens. It requires valuing restraint as much as decisiveness. It requires understanding that public trust is built not through control, but through fairness. The woman's story, reduced in official records to charges and timestamps, is more than a cautionary tale. It is a mirror reflecting the gap between the ideals of policing and its lived reality. It shows how quickly care can become coercion, how easily suspicion can harden into certainty, and how devastating the consequences can be for those caught in between. In the end, this case is not just about one officer or one woman. It is about a system that too often mistakes authority for infallibility, a system that equates challenge with defiance, a system that measures success by compliance rather than justice. The bodycam captures the moment, but the lesson extends far beyond it. As long as discretion is exercised without accountability, and as long as emotional humanity is treated as a liability rather than a constant, these stories will continue to repeat quietly, routinely, and with profound human cost.